There's a specific kind of miscalculation that runs through almost every avoidant betrayal, one that rarely gets discussed because it requires admitting something uncomfortable about how little foresight actually goes into the decision in the moment it happens. The avoidant doesn't sit down and weigh the long-term consequences of dishonesty, of emotional infidelity, of choosing self-protection over integrity against what it might eventually cost them. They act from a much narrower, more immediate place. Driven by discomfort they need to escape right now, and the future consequence simply doesn't register as real until it's already arrived, fully formed, and impossible to undo. If the listener has ever wondered how someone capable of causing so much damage seemed to have so little awareness of what they were setting into motion, this exploration is going to walk through exactly why that blindness happens and exactly how thoroughly it eventually catches up with them. Betrayal for an avoidant rarely begins as a calculated decision. It usually begins as an escape route, a way of relieving the unbearable pressure that closeness and accountability create inside someone whose nervous system treats vulnerability as danger. In the moment betrayal happens, whether it's dishonesty, secrecy, emotional withdrawal disguised as fidelity, or something more overt, the avoidant is rarely thinking about the person they're hurting at all. They're thinking about the discomfort they're trying to escape, the suffocating sense of being seen too closely, of being expected to show up in ways that feel unbearably exposing. Betrayal, in this framework, isn't malice. It's avoidance taken to its most destructive conclusion, a person choosing short-term relief over long-term integrity, because long-term thinking has never been where their attention naturally goes. This is precisely why the fallout so often blindsides them. Someone who wasn't thinking about consequences while committing the betrayal certainly wasn't thinking about consequences that might unfold months or years later, consequences that extend far beyond the immediate relationship into how they're perceived by everyone who eventually learns what happened, into how they perceive themselves, into the foundation of trust they'll need to build every future relationship on top of. The avoidant, in the moment, is solving for right now. They are not solving for who they'll become, or what reputation they'll carry, or how heavily this single choice will weigh against every future attempt at closeness they try to build afterward. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something directly to the listener who has lived through exactly this kind of betrayal, wondering, perhaps for a long time, whether the person who hurt them ever grasped the scale of what they'd done. In the immediate aftermath, it likely didn't look like they understood at all. Avoidants tend to respond to the discovery of their own betrayal with the same defensive machinery they use for every other threat, minimizing, deflecting, sometimes even reframing themselves as the injured party in an attempt to escape the discomfort of full accountability. This response can look from the outside like a complete absence of remorse, like someone who simply doesn't care about the damage they caused. But absence of visible remorse in the moment is not the same as absence of consequence over time, and what tends to unfold afterward often looks nothing like what the initial reaction suggested. To understand why betrayal eventually ruins so much more than the avoidant anticipated, it helps to understand what actually gets destroyed in the process, because it's rarely limited to a single relationship. Betrayal, once discovered, doesn't stay contained to the two people directly involved. It travels. Mutual friends learn what happened. Family members form opinions. Future partners, if the avoidant is honest at all, or if word travels through shared circles, encounter this history before they even have the chance to form their own independent judgment. The avoidant, who spent so much energy trying to protect a carefully managed self-image, discovers too late that betrayal is one of the few things capable of permanently altering that image in the eyes of everyone who hears about it, regardless of how composed or reasonable they manage to appear afterward. There's a specific irony worth sitting with here, because betrayal is so often committed in service of protecting the avoidant's sense of control, their ability to escape discomfort on their own terms rather than sit inside it. And yet betrayal is one of the few acts capable of stripping that control away entirely and permanently. Once trust is broken through betrayal specifically, rather than through simple incompatibility or a relationship quietly ending, the avoidant loses the ability to control how the story gets told. They can no longer manage the narrative the way they might have managed a more conventional breakup, framing it as mutual, as timing, as simply not working out. Betrayal has a specificity to it that resists this kind of vague reframing. It has a clear cause, a clear moment, a clear party responsible, and that clarity removes exactly the narrative control the avoidant was trying to protect by betraying in the first place. It's worth examining what happens inside the avoidant once this loss of narrative control becomes undeniable, because it produces a very particular kind of internal crisis. For years, possibly for their entire adult life, the avoidant has operated under the assumption that maintaining composure, maintaining a reasonable and unbothered exterior, would protect them from ever having to face the full social and psychological weight of their actions. Betrayal disrupts this assumption completely. There is no composed way to explain betrayal that doesn't eventually require some acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and even the most carefully worded explanation cannot fully erase the plain fact of what happened. This creates a crack in the avoidant's self-protective architecture that doesn't easily seal back up, because unlike other forms of avoidant behavior that can be reframed as personality quirks or communication differences, betrayal resists reframing. It simply is what it is, and everyone who learns about it tends to understand it the same way, regardless of how the avoidant tries to explain their side of the story. This is where the true delayed cost of betrayal starts to become visible, because it rarely shows up as a single, contained consequence. It shows up as erosion, gradual and cumulative, across every area of the avoidant's life that depends on being trusted. Professional relationships, if the betrayal becomes known within shared circles, can suffer in subtle but persistent ways. Colleagues and collaborators forming quiet judgments that never get spoken directly, but nonetheless shape how much responsibility or vulnerability they're willing to extend. Friendships often fracture, sometimes immediately, sometimes slowly, as mutual friends recalibrate how much they trust the avoidance version of events in general, not just in relation to this specific betrayal. And future romantic relationships carry an invisible weight that the avoidant themselves often cannot fully explain to new partners, a residue of self-distrust that surfaces at unexpected moments, undermining intimacy. The avoidant is trying, sometimes genuinely, to build. It's worth naming something directly here, because it matters for how the listener understands the shape of consequence in situations like this. The avoidant rarely faces a single dramatic reckoning, a moment where everything collapses at once in a way that mirrors the intensity of the original betrayal. What they face instead is something slower and in many ways more corrosive, an accumulation of smaller consequences that never fully resolve, each one a quiet reminder of the choice that set everything in motion. This is often harder to process than a single dramatic consequence would be, because there's no clear endpoint, no moment where the debt feels paid in full. It simply continues unevenly across years, resurfacing whenever trust becomes relevant again, in a new relationship, in a professional setting, in a moment of vulnerability, with someone new who deserves honesty. The avoidant isn't always certain they're capable of providing anymore. There's a particular psychological toll that comes from having permanently altered how one is perceived, and it deserves careful description because it goes beyond simple guilt or regret. It touches something closer to identity fragmentation. Before the betrayal, the avoidant likely held on to some internal narrative of themselves as fundamentally reasonable, fundamentally decent, someone who might struggle with closeness but who wasn't capable of true harm. Betrayal shatters this narrative in a way few other actions can. It forces the avoidant to reconcile with the fact that they are capable of the exact kind of harm they always assumed only other people, worse people, less self-aware people were capable of causing. This reconciliation rarely happens smoothly. It tends to produce a prolonged period of internal instability, a person no longer certain how to think about themselves once the previous, more flattering story has become impossible to fully believe. It's worth exploring how this identity fragmentation manifests behaviourally, because it often produces contradictory patterns that can look confusing from the outside. Some avoidants respond to this fracture with increased defensiveness, doubling down on justifications, surrounding themselves with people who won't challenge the story they're telling themselves, avoiding any environment where the full weight of what happened might resurface. Others respond with a kind of overcorrected self-punishment, becoming excessively self-critical, sometimes to a degree that borders on its own form of avoidance, using harsh self-judgment as a way of appearing to take accountability without actually doing the deeper, more uncomfortable work of genuine change. Neither response resolves the underlying fracture. Both are simply different strategies for managing a discomfort that resists easy resolution. For the listener who experienced this betrayal directly, who may have spent considerable time wondering whether the person who hurt them ever truly understood what they cost themselves in the process, there's something worth sitting with here. The absence of visible devastation in the immediate aftermath doesn't mean devastation never arrives. It simply means it arrives on a different timeline, often invisible to the person who was betrayed, unfolding entirely within the avoidant's own private experience of themselves, in moments no one else witnesses. This isn't a guarantee of justice in any conventional sense, and it would be dishonest to frame it that way. But it does mean the betrayal rarely functions as the clean escape the avoidant believed it would be in the moment they committed it. It's worth exploring too how the specific damage betrayal causes tends to compound over time rather than fade, which runs counter to what the avoidant likely assumed while trying to justify the decision. Most avoidant behaviour operates on an assumption that time heals discomfort, that enough distance will eventually dissolve whatever tension a given choice creates. This assumption holds reasonably well for ordinary avoidant withdrawal, for the kind of distance that simply ends a relationship without any specific act of harm attached to it. Betrayal operates differently because it establishes a clear, undeniable breach rather than a vague drifting apart. It becomes a fixed reference point that doesn't fade the way ordinary relational disappointment does. Every future instance of vulnerability, every future relationship that requires trust, risks summoning this fixed point back into relevance, regardless of how much time has passed since the original event. This is part of why so many avoidants who commit betrayal find themselves unable to fully move past it even years later, even after outwardly appearing to have rebuilt a stable, composed life. The betrayal becomes something they carry rather than something they resolve, a permanent feature of their internal landscape that resurfaces whenever a new relationship asks them to be vulnerable in ways that echo, even faintly, the vulnerability they failed to honour the first time. Some avoidants eventually do the work necessary to integrate this history honestly, building genuine trust in new relationships through consistent demonstrated change, rather than simply hoping enough time will make the past irrelevant. Many others never quite manage this integration, instead carrying a low, persistent undercurrent of self-distrust into every subsequent attempt at closeness, sabotaging new relationships preemptively out of a fear that history will inevitably repeat itself. There's a dimension of this consequence worth exploring that goes beyond reputation and touches something more intimate, the avoidance relationship with solitude itself. Before betrayal, solitude functioned as a refuge for most avoidants, a space where they could retreat from the discomfort of closeness and recover a sense of control. After betrayal, solitude often takes on a different character entirely. Alone with their own thoughts, without the distraction of a relationship or the immediate pressure of managing another person's expectations, the avoidant frequently finds that solitude no longer offers the same relief it once did. Instead, it becomes a space where the betrayal replays uninvited, where justifications that felt convincing in company start to sound thin and unconvincing in the quiet. What was once a sanctuary slowly becomes a room they'd rather not sit in for too long. And this shift, subtle as it is, represents one of the more significant costs of betrayal that rarely gets acknowledged directly. It's worth examining how this altered relationship with solitude affects the avoidant's daily functioning over time, because it tends to produce a kind of restlessness that wasn't present before. Many avoidants who have committed a significant betrayal report, whether to themselves or occasionally to a therapist, an increased difficulty simply being still, an unfamiliar need to stay busy, distracted, occupied by anything that prevents extended time alone with their own thoughts. This restlessness is often mistaken, even by the avoidant themselves, for renewed ambition or a healthy new hobby, when in reality it frequently functions as another form of avoidance, this time directed not at a person, but at the discomfort of their own unresolved conscience. The betrayal, in this way, doesn't just damage external relationships. It fundamentally alters the avoidant's internal relationship with themselves, transforming solitude from refuge into something closer to confrontation. There's also something worth exploring about how betrayal specifically undermines an avoidant's ability to receive genuine intimacy, even in relationships that have nothing to do with the original harm. Trust, once broken through a deliberate act of betrayal rather than simple withdrawal, doesn't just damage how others perceive the avoidant. It damages how the avoidant perceives their own trustworthiness, which in turn affects how much they allow themselves to be trusted going forward. A person who believes, even privately, that they are capable of significant betrayal often develops a reflexive skepticism toward anyone who offers them unconditional trust afterward, assuming, consciously or not, that such trust is either naive or temporary, destined to be revoked once the other person eventually learns what the avoidant is truly capable of. This assumption can sabotage healthy relationships that follow, not because the new partner has done anything wrong, but because the avoidant's own damaged self-trust makes it difficult to fully receive care without suspicion. This self-sabotage often manifests in specific, recognizable patterns worth naming here. Some avoidants become excessively transparent in new relationships, almost compulsively confessing minor faults or insecurities in an attempt to preempt the discovery of anything worse, exhausting new partners with a level of disclosure that has more to do with managing their own anxiety than with genuine intimacy. Others swing toward the opposite extreme, becoming even more guarded than before the betrayal, reasoning, however unconsciously, that if they were once capable of such significant harm, the safest path forward is simply to avoid closeness altogether, sparing any future partner from a repeat of what happened previously. Neither pattern represents healthy resolution. Both represent an avoidant nervous system still organizing itself around a wound it hasn't fully processed. It's worth pausing to consider how this entire trajectory compares to what the avoidant likely imagined would happen in the moment they chose betrayal over honesty. In that moment, the imagined future probably involved relief, a sense of having escaped an unbearable situation, perhaps some initial discomfort followed by a return to whatever equilibrium existed before the relationship became too demanding. What actually tends to unfold looks almost nothing like this. Instead of relief, there's often prolonged unease. Instead of returning to a previous equilibrium, there's frequently a permanent alteration of how the avoidant relates to closeness altogether. A new baseline of guardedness or overcorrected vulnerability that didn't exist before. The gap between the anticipated outcome and the actual outcome is, in many cases, the central tragedy of avoidant betrayal. A decision made in service of short-term relief that produces long-term consequences, bearing almost no resemblance to what was actually being sought. There's something worth naming about how this gap between expectation and reality reflects a broader pattern in avoidant decision-making generally, one that extends well beyond betrayal specifically. Avoidants, by the nature of their defensive structure, tend to be remarkably poor predictors of their own future emotional states, particularly when it comes to consequences that unfold slowly rather than immediately. This isn't a matter of intelligence or insight in other areas of life. It's a specific blind spot created by a lifetime of prioritizing immediate emotional relief over longer-term emotional forecasting. A pattern reinforced every time withdrawal successfully reduced short-term discomfort, without the avoidant ever having to sit with or examine the longer-term cost. Betrayal simply represents the most extreme version of this pattern, the moment where the gap between immediate relief and long-term consequence becomes too large to ignore any longer. For the listener who may be wondering whether naming all of this amounts to excusing what happened, it's worth being direct about the distinction being drawn here. Understanding why someone commits betrayal, understanding the psychological blindness that allows them to act without foreseeing the full weight of the consequence, does not minimize the harm caused or excuse the choice that was made. It simply explains why the aftermath often looks the way it does. Why an avoidant who seemed so composed and unaffected in the immediate aftermath frequently ends up experiencing a much deeper and more prolonged reckoning than anyone watching from the outside would have predicted at the time. Explanation and excuse are not the same thing, and holding space for the former does not require abandoning clarity about the latter. It's also worth naming the specific role that shame plays in prolonging this reckoning far longer than guilt alone would. Guilt, as explored elsewhere, tends to focus on the specific act and its impact on another person, and guilt, when properly metabolized, can lead to genuine repair, whether through direct amends or through demonstrated change in future behavior. Shame operates differently. Shame convinces a person that the betrayal reflects something fundamentally, irreparably wrong with who they are, rather than simply something they did. This distinction matters enormously for how the avoidant's internal reckoning unfolds. An avoidant caught in shame rather than guilt often becomes paralyzed rather than motivated, more likely to hide from the consequence entirely than to engage with it constructively, which paradoxically extends and deepens the very ruin they're trying so hard to avoid confronting directly. This paralysis often explains why so many avoidants who commit significant betrayal never actually reach out to acknowledge what happened, even years later, even when enough time has passed that such an acknowledgement might no longer carry the same immediate risk it once did. Shame keeps the door closed, long after guilt alone might have opened it. The longer this door stays closed, the more the internal ruin compounds, unaddressed, unspoken, carried privately into every subsequent chapter of the avoidant's life, a weight that never gets set down because setting it down would require exactly the kind of vulnerable disclosure the avoidant has spent their entire life organizing their behavior around avoiding. There's one more layer worth examining here concerning what happens when an avoidance betrayal becomes known not through confrontation, but through quiet, indirect discovery, the way betrayal so often comes to light in an age where information travels easily between shared social circles. When betrayal is exposed this way, gradually, through overheard conversations or secondhand accounts, rather than through a single dramatic confrontation, the avoidant loses the ability to control even the timing of their own reckoning. They cannot prepare a response, cannot rehearse an explanation, cannot manage the narrative before it reaches the people whose opinion matters most to them. This lack of control over timing often produces a specific, prolonged anxiety, a persistent uncertainty about who already knows, who is still forming an opinion, who might bring it up unexpectedly in a setting the avoidant cannot escape gracefully. This anxiety, sustained over months or years, represents its own toll, one the avoidant rarely anticipated while assuming betrayal could remain contained. It's worth exploring too how this dynamic interacts with an avoidance relationship to their own children, if children are eventually part of the picture, because betrayal committed earlier in life doesn't stay confined to the timeline in which it happened. Children grow older and form their own capacity to hear and process complicated histories about the people who raised them. An avoidant who assumed a long ago betrayal was safely buried in the past sometimes discovers, years later, that it resurfaces in unexpected ways, shaping how their own children eventually come to understand them. This isn't guaranteed in every case, but it represents one of the many ways betrayal's cost extends far beyond the immediate timeline the avoidant was thinking about when the decision was made. There's something worth saying too about the specific loneliness that accompanies carrying this kind of unresolved history privately, especially for avoidants who never develop the capacity for genuine repair. Unlike other forms of relational pain, which can often be processed openly with friends, family, or a therapist without excessive shame, betrayal tends to isolate the person who committed it, because openly discussing it risks the very exposure they've spent so much energy trying to avoid. This means the avoidant often processes the full weight of what they did almost entirely alone, without the benefit of outside perspective, without the relief that comes from voicing a difficult truth to someone capable of responding with something other than judgment. This isolation compounds the original wound rather than healing it, creating a closed loop where the avoidant's shame prevents exactly the kind of connection that might eventually help them move through it. For anyone listening who wonders whether this trajectory sounds too severe to match what actually happens with people who commit betrayal and appear from the outside to move on relatively unscathed, it's worth acknowledging honestly that outcomes vary. Not every avoidant experiences this reckoning with equal intensity, and some manage, through a combination of denial, distraction, and genuinely limited introspective capacity, to avoid ever fully confronting what they did. But even in these cases, something is usually lost, even if it never rises to the level of visible devastation. A capacity for full intimacy narrows. A baseline level of trust in themselves erodes, even if only slightly, even if never consciously named. The ruin doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a slow, permanent diminishment of how deeply someone allows themselves to be known, a consequence quiet enough to escape outside notice, but real nonetheless to the person quietly living with it. The devastation the avoidant eventually experiences, however real, however lasting, was never actually the point of anyone else's healing. It exists as its own separate consequence, playing out entirely within the avoidant's own life, disconnected from whatever recovery the person they hurt manages to build for themselves. Whether or not the avoidant ever fully grasps what they cost themselves doesn't determine whether the person they betrayed gets to move forward, rebuild trust in themselves, and eventually find closeness with someone capable of honoring it properly. The ruin the avoidant brought upon their own life unfolds, regardless of anyone else's attention to it. A quiet, ongoing consequence that requires no audience, no confirmation, and no involvement from the person who was hurt in order to remain completely, permanently real.